Welcome to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast with Darren Mitchell. If you're a sales leader looking to take your leadership to a whole new level, then this is the podcast for you. We'll be exploring tips, techniques, and strategies to help you take your leadership to the exceptional level and allow you to enjoy more money, more meaning, and better sales results. Welcome to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast. Darren Mitchell here on a beautiful Thursday as we're recording this in the Macedon Ranges here, deep in the middle of winter. And I must say it was -3 degrees Celsius this morning when we got out. It was just ice all over the place. Today I'm joined by Mr. Richard Cogswell, who is also living in the same. Today is also the 1st of August where you are, because you're in Singapore. Albeit a few hours behind, but I'm sure that it's not -3. It's probably more like 33 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, constant all year round, Darren. It's super consistent in Singapore. All we really have to contend with is a kind of monsoon type of rainfall every now and then. But yeah, very, very consistent here. I'm glad not to experience -3.
Yeah, it's amazing what you get used to, but it is every now and then nice to get to somewhere where it's warm, where you don't have to try to put warm water on your fingers to try and warm up. So yes. We're not here to talk about the weather. We are here to talk about sales, and particularly sales leadership and culture. You're very passionate on culture and the importance of culture in business. You've got a very extensive background in sales, currently the Vice President of Business Development at Nium. And you've been in the card payments space for a long, long time, but more recently an author as well. So love to delve into a little bit of your background, because this will be a fascinating conversation as it relates to culture. And as I said before we press record, I'm sure there's going to be some cliches that get pulled out through this conversation.
Let's do it.
So Richard, before we jump into the nitty gritty, love for you to give us a little bit of, I guess, the backstory of Richard and what kind of led you to do what you do now, and certainly becoming an author, because it's not something that everybody necessarily has as an aspiration in their career, if you like.
No, you're absolutely right, Darren. So I guess my story, I, like many, fell into sales. I was in a bit of a hurry when I kind of left university, and I wanted to get into the workspace. There weren't a lot of opportunities at the time. And my first ever gig was actually commission-only insurance sales, which is probably the hardest thing you can probably ever do, in what was actually very kind of aggressive environment. And I think, right from the get-go, I was learning things about culture and things that, over time I was really setting myself in opposition to. But, didn't have a tremendous direction per se, but managed to fall into the payments industry pretty quickly. And I've really been, I guess, about 85% of my career at the sort of nexus of what I call technology, payments, and data. Started off in the UK around our ACH, our automated clearinghouse, selling enterprise software solutions that gravitated to e-invoicing, e-billing. That's what eventually brought me to Singapore, as I followed a customer of mine who basically offered me a role to lead their sales team out in Asia Pacific. And then, as you say, for the last 6 years or so, I've been in the card issuing space. So really always in sales. And as I say, for the most part in the payments industry. What led me to writing a book? Well, look, I think through the course of my career, I was, like many, promoted to sales leadership with no training at all, and trying to find my way in that. And
that seems to be a common theme.
It's very common, and I write about this. So, as I was trying to find my way in what is a very new environment, you're kind of falling back on what you may or may not recognize as strengths, right? Yeah. And I think one of those has always been this attitude of being something of a servant leader and giving something to others, or trying to. And so I've always had this sort of coaching mentality. And over the years, I've also had positions where I've sort of been the first salesperson on the ground to build a customer base from scratch and then build a sales team.
Yeah.
So I've quite often built sort of internalized training around, all kinds of topics, prospecting, value propositions, land and expand type of techniques with existing customers. And, that's all been something I've generated for internal use. A few years ago, quite early in my Singapore journey, I was headhunted by Randstad, which
Hmm.
again is not in the payments industry. But that was quite an interesting couple of years, because what they were looking to do was differentiate from others in their space. There's a top four there, but they're very sort of PowerPoint led. And if you have an RFP or an RFI, a customer could quite easily hear four different PowerPoints saying exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
And so these guys wanted to put it, turn it on its head and use some of the techniques from the sort of IT sales industry of value propositions, even challenger sale,
Yeah.
kind of keep the PowerPoint in the back pocket. So I wrote a course around that. But, so I've had that in the locker, I suppose. But it was actually a number of experiences I had about 3 years ago, which triggered me, I suppose, to write the book.
Mm.
Um, and I'll just illustrate a couple of them because I think they're interesting for the conversation. One of them was, you're in your network, right? And the amount of times you're talking to someone and it's apparent that the organization they're working for, even though it's highly sales led, doesn't have an articulated go to market. Just shocks me always, right? So there's that. Um, I had at the time just left a company that was very culturally driven, in the sense that the CEO was always very mindful of executive coaching relationships, and sort of pushed that all the way through the organizational structure. So essentially all directors and above were also encouraged to have that sort of a capability, I suppose, but also be conscious of the culture that was there and that we were creating.
Mm.
So, and that again is quite unusual, I think, to have something within an organization that is ultimately very ambitious, very sales driven,
Yeah.
but is culturally minded. But one of the things that really triggered me, I was actually lucky enough to be on a session with a company called New Campus, which is a kind of online university for the leaders of tomorrow within Southeast Asia. And I was in this group of about 40 people, all first-time leaders, incredibly diverse group, every industry you can think of, every country in Southeast Asia you can think of. And one of the challenges was to go away and think of what are your top three, difficulties, I suppose,
Hmm.
what are the problems you're facing? And everyone came back with the same issues I felt I had, right, way back when. And, when you're in it, you can feel as if it's all totally unique to you.
Mm.
So ultimately, all I tried to do in writing this was, think about the kind of book I was looking for at various stages of my sales leadership journey. The promotion stage, when you're actually asked to come in and turn something around that perhaps isn't functioning, when you're starting something up from scratch, and try to bring some of the lessons that I've learned in terms of not only thinking culturally, but fusing that to a go-to-market and
Mm.
creating something special that people stay for ultimately, and and
Yeah.
and and perform exceptionally within. That
Yeah.
that was the goal.
Yeah. Love it. And I like how you said, well, there's a couple of things in what you said. Number one, you kind of went from an individual contributor to a sales leader without any real documented, formalized transition process. It was like, hey, Richard, you're a phenomenal salesperson, so let's just anoint you as a sales leader and
Right.
just go do your thing, man. That'll be awesome. Um, but also
Yes.
thinking about, well, what are some of the tools that you would need if you probably had your time over again that you would like to have as resources to help you make that transition a little bit smoother. Um,
100%.
I
Yeah.
know the book is all about culture, and you mentioned also servant leadership, which I'm a huge fan of, and I always do that. Speak to leaders about that when it comes to the mentoring and the coaching and the facilitation I do. Um, when you have people in a big organization, and when you have perhaps senior leaders, and the organization you were talking about where they had a focus on executive coaching, which is quite unique in
Mm,
organizations because it's all about
yeah,
the number, the number, the number. When you have people that are running big organizations, and it's a big company and it's focused on profitability, and they talk about, well, we are mission led, we are vision led, we put the customer in the center of everything we do. um, I get a sense that there's a lot of conditions obviously attached to a lot of these organizations. And we kind of talked about this before we press record, that
yeah,
culture seems to be and I love your take on this. Culture seems to be at the forefront of everything we do, as long as we're getting the numbers, as long as we're being profitable, as long as I guess the profit and loss statement is looking where it needs to be. If
yeah,
it's not, then hey, culture gets put to the side and we need to actually now put all hands to the pump, which creates
yes,
a new unwritten, unset of values, behaviors, and therefore creates a unique and maybe a different subculture.
yes,
What's your take on that? Because I I just want to get, whether it's just for me in terms of validation that I'm
yes,
not the only person, or
yes.
is am am I wrong?
Okay, here's my perspective on that. I think the longer you're in sales, obviously the more you're going to experience, right? And you're always going to be in one of those moments where, the bosses come in and it's an emergency meeting, right? And sales aren't performing, and you're lurching into hyperactivity, and often it's too late, right?
Mm,
Especially in the context of where I come from. I know that's not strictly true of every sales environment, but where I come from in a B2B context where you have a complex sale, long sales cycles, if you're suddenly pulled into a room and it's like, 24-hour cold calling, you've got a problem, right? And it's also, generally speaking, in those moments that sales is not so fun anymore. There's
yeah.
a lot of pressure. So, what also tends to come with that is environments that are living and surviving financial year to financial year. And I would almost guarantee there's no real plan, right? Go and find the sales plan. There won't be one, right?
No.
Um, and again, I just reflect on when I was first promoted, everything you said was spot on. There's this sort of leadership is inherent idea. You're
Mm,
successful there, therefore you'll be successful here, which is nuts because
yeah.
you've suddenly got so much more to contend with. And I honestly, I didn't change anything other than I brought more enthusiasm and
Mm,
perhaps a coaching sensibility. But before I was, promoted, we were living financial year to financial year, and it was the same afterwards.
yeah.
And it took me a year and a half to even ask for any support, right? Let alone investment in myself.
Yeah.
So so what you say is spot on. Culture goes out the window at this point, but to my mind, there's a better way, right? Which is to be structured about how you meld your vision and your go-to-market to your culture.
Mm,
And to me, but if you're structured about building a solid go-to-market plan that everyone understands, that's aligned across cross-functional groups and leadership,
mm,
that is identified, what are your winning use cases? How do we replicate that? That gets you away from sort of shotgun approaches to market and any type of deal, right? You kind of identified who are your profitable customers. And you've done that sort of detective work to understand your business so that you're actually focusing, right, the aperture so that you're actually doing more
mm,
successful business. Already that should bring some elements of stability. And then if you weld culture to that, then you've got a magic sauce because in those environments where I have seen culture married to a go to market, you're basically unleashing the passion of the people around you, right? Um, and you're effectively conferring on them the sort of responsibility to think creatively about their businesses and therefore the business.
mm,
And you're creating an environment where good ideas can come from anywhere. And then you're into an environment where you're not lurching in from panic station to panic station. You're into incremental gains, right?
yeah. Yeah.
And then if you can then fuse, okay, this is our financial year, but this is our 3 to 5 year plan, then you've got something people will stay for and
Mm.
people will protect. But you've got to work at this as if the job of building culture is fragile, right?
Mm.
Because it's very easily derailed. So that's really where I'm coming from. I think if you're already in that sort of survival mode where you're off plan and suddenly panic stations, that's the type of environment, frankly, I would like to come in and fix. You know what I mean? Um, so that's really where I'm coming from. I think, I have a lot of time as well for leaders who will say, all of this culture stuff's quite fluffy, and you got to drive to the number. But that's and in some circumstances, some industries, some sales environments, I think that's probably legitimate, right?
Yeah.
KPI driven environments, right?
Yeah.
But if you can actually create behaviors that create culture that lead to results, then you're in a totally different world. That's really where I'm coming from.
And it fits perfectly, I guess, with the title of the book, the cultural sales leader, where you're talking about sustaining people and attaining results. So what we're not
Right.
saying here is we're not going to create a nice and fluffy kumbaya type environment where everybody feels comfortable coming in and the standards are really low. So it's okay if you don't
Yeah,
make that phone call today. We're not talking about that at all, because at the end of the day,
absolutely.
businesses
Absolutely.
have to be sustainably successful. But in order for
Yes.
those businesses to be sustainably, say that quickly with a mouthful of marbles, sustainably successful,
Yeah.
then we want to be able to build a high performing culture, which
Yes.
means the standards of excellence are going to be almost uncompromising. And it's
Darren, that
okay
is
if you're not
spot
there.
on.
Yeah.
That is spot on. None of this is to deny ambition. None of this is to deny aggression in the marketplace,
Mm.
right? I, the most culturally aligned sort of environment I've ever worked in also happened to be the most ambitious.
Hmm.
You know, you're just tying the two things together,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And I also think, there's a lot of talk. You see a lot of debate on LinkedIn and in companies, you know, creating a psychologically safe space for a diverse group to work in and to raise issues and to debate, right? That's really part and parcel of this as well, right? But none of that is, there's a lot of soft skills involved in creating that, but
Yeah.
none of that is diminishing at all
No.
what is front and center, which is the achievement of whatever your ambition is. And
Yeah.
I very much think of this as a sort of layering process, right? To be very simplistic about it, you become expert in what the business is telling you. The pipeline's going to tell you certain things about where you need to focus, etc. Right?
Yeah.
You've got to understand your people, who's with you on the journey, what skills you might be lacking, etc., etc. You've got to have these fundamental building blocks in place. But then when you simplify this down to your communicable sort of one pager, front and center is always going to be your financials, always going to be
Mm.
your goals. And everything that is based around values, behaviors, focuses, what needs to be true to win, big bets, all of that is in service of that goal.
Yeah.
But the how you do it is just
Yeah.
as important as anything else,
Yeah.
and is often to my mind the bit that will transform an environment and transform results. I when I brought this to environments I've worked in, I'm thinking about one which I entered, which was a turnaround situation. We had horrible situations on the ground with an isolated team that was, not performing. There were some people issues in there as well. You could say cultural issues. Did a complete reset of that, but doubled that business in under 2 years.
Yeah.
So that ambitious element of it has to be part of it.
Mm. Oh, and
And
yeah, absolutely. Now keep going because
Yeah.
there was more gold coming then.
No, no, no. I think I'd reached the end of it, but yeah, no, I think that's a vitally important part. But again, I think a lot of this is about trust. I think again, you can work in certain environments like founder cultures or work for certain bosses who, again, perhaps have been promoted from single contribution, are basically acting in a similar fashion where that trust is not necessarily there. And I
Yeah.
think again, I think that's the journey that perhaps you've got to take certain people on their leadership journey to
Mm.
understand the value of some of the elements that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Um,
I love what you're talking about there because we want to be really, really clear. Because when we talk about exceptional sales leadership, we're not just talking about being an exceptional person who loves giving hugs and has the Friday barbecue for the team to make them feel comfortable. We're talking about
yeah,
leaders that are uncompromising in the pursuit of excellence, and part of that
mm,
excellence is achieving extraordinary results they've never achieved before.
yeah,
But it's about the pursuit of excellence that then can become sustainable. And you can't do that without building an extraordinary culture. So
yes,
it's
yes,
it's two. So I don't want
yeah,
people listening to this and say, "Oh, this is all woo woo and nice and fluffy." It's not. It
yeah,
is fundamental to long-term success. Because if you look at any successful organization, sporting team, they will always talk about the importance of culture, of relationship, of connection, because
yeah,
that enables people to be the very best versions they can be in a psychologically safe environment. When you put that
yes,
all together and you have a leader that coordinates that, all of a sudden they start to achieve some extraordinary results that they look back and think, geez, how the hell did we do this? I don't know how we did this, but hey, it's
yeah.
a it's almost like a manifestation of what we've created in terms of environment. Now,
Yeah, I could illustrate that in a couple of ways. I think I love your sporting analogy, and I also love something else you've spoken about in the past, which is about, a leader should really be trying to make themselves redundant, right?
yes.
Which I know is very emotive language, but what I think you're essentially saying there is that you've got to create other leaders, right? You've got to find those sources that will take your values and behaviors through and reinforce them,
Yep.
and drive them through. I think in large part this creation of a psychological safe space and culture is also about getting out of the way of your people or enabling them to be their best.
Mm.
But a lot of this is, you can have KPIs which are driving people to do certain things, and they're probably serving those KPIs as opposed to actually getting you to where you need to be. Or you can be sort of promoting behaviors. So, for example, I think of, escalations. There's always environments where you're constantly being escalated to. So you're always being dragged down into the trenches, essentially, right?
Mm.
And, a good way of breaking that is to throw it back, right? What do you think we should do? Who have you spoken to? And confer that responsibility back on people so that they start thinking creatively, which again is not to say that nothing can be escalated, but it does put some responsibility on people to think things through. And if you can start to push that out, not just within the sales team, but cross-functional areas as well, because they're aligned and understand what you're trying to achieve also, and you've encouraged people to build their networks,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
to win together. That does change things, because then as a leader, you're in the business of what can I do to help you? What do you
Mm.
need? Right? You've conferred trust on them. You've seen that trust return. And it also then frees you to start to think about the longer term journey.
Mm.
And if you've taken a group through some difficulties and then start proposing what a 3 to 5 year journey looks like based upon certain big bets or certain investments or new markets or whatever it might be, believe you me, people stay for that, because if people are growing,
Mm.
they see success, and they're having fun, why would they leave, right? But
Yeah.
the final point I just want to make on that, and I go back to your sporting analogy, it's just so fragile. How many of our sporting teams have you seen rise and fall, right? There'll be a superstar, all the pressure is to keep them, but they're not aligned to a team dynamic or what have
Mm.
you, right?
Yeah.
And I actually use a quote I mean, this may turn certain people off, so I have to be careful. But I use a quote from Arsene Wenger, right, who was, the most successful manager of Arsenal Football Club, and he spoke about culture as if it was a flower. It's something that you need to tend, and if you tend to it, it can grow. But
Hmm.
if you neglect it, it will die,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's such a simple idea, but it's a very true one, right?
Mm.
You're only one headhunter, one merger or acquisition away from your culture, being destroyed essentially, right?
100%.
So it is something
100%.
you've got to continuously work at.
And it's not easy because a lot of this, you said before, and we know this, a lot of individual contributors who are successful get put into a leadership position. They
Right.
don't necessarily, not only do they not have the transition plan, but maybe the people putting them into that position haven't really thought about the characteristics or whether the makeup of this particular individual is suitable to a leadership position. So
Yeah.
they might be a different
Yeah.
personality style, and then they become like a fish out of water, and then they default back to what they know to be true for them, and that is potentially hunting and doing all the deals. And through that
Yes.
process, now they've got people reporting to them, they disintermediate them, and all of a sudden a new underlying culture is created. One of my biggest bugbears around sales leadership is the number of organizations that promote the fact that it's okay for sales leaders to lead by being absent from their team. And
Mm,
when I say that, they almost require their sales leaders to be strategizing, to be doing peer reviews, to be doing meetings up with the bigger upper echelons. It's almost like we need you to be managing upwards and
mm,
manage your team from a little bit of a distance.
mm,
And they give them offices, and whatever the case might be. That
mm.
in itself creates a really challenging culture because you've got people at different stages of their own development and experience in your team. And I say to sales leaders all the time, if you want to build credibility within your team, you've got to be visible to your team. And it sounds a
Yeah.
bit of a cliche, but the greatest gift you can give your team members is the gift of your attention. And you
Yes.
can't give them your attention if you're sitting in offices and, dare I say it with the greatest amount of respect, navel gazing or
Yes.
pontificating. Get in front of
Yes.
your people. So I wanted to talk to you about your
Yes.
thought process around building a a great sales environment. There's
Yes.
a culture that unleashes potential. And specifically, because I want to give people some key things that they can actually think about today, or at least benchmark against what they're doing today in their own environment, that might be able to do one or two things. Verify, hey, we're on the right track, keep doing it, or I need to make some tweaks and some changes because I don't think I've got the best environment yet, but there's possibilities. So, from
Mm.
your perspective, what are some key elements of sales culture or some key behaviors that are really important that we should be focusing on or almost prioritizing?
Yeah. Look, I recognize everything that you've said there. I think, look, I think one thing you can do is really bring your teams into processes that perhaps they might not be normally brought into, right? And I always think about budgeting time.
Yeah.
Um, and again, you can see all kinds of environments the longer you're in sales. It shocks me when you work in an environment where, there's no budgeting process and suddenly the numbers given to you like January 1st, right? And you're suddenly at the bottom of the mountain looking up and you have this, how are you going to eat the elephant type of approach. To my mind, you should be looking at the next year's budget as you're prosecuting the year you're in, right? So Q3, Q4, whenever it is before anything happens. And one of the things that I started doing quite early on, and I still do, is I will ask the individuals at the sales team for their sales plan,
Hmm.
right? Now, I'll give them a template because otherwise you're going to get all kinds of different PowerPoints in all kinds of
That's
different
it.
all kinds of different structures. But I'm basically saying, what are you going to focus on? Where are you going to bring in the majority of your budget, given that we know it's going to be factored within a certain range, right? What do you need to win? What are the risks and opportunities? And if they're looking after existing customers, I'll ask also for a kind of run rate forecast of that existing customer, plus what opportunities there are in terms of identified additional opportunities and what
Yeah.
the, you know, what that could bring. And of course, you're going to have your top-down piece, whether it's coming from finance or the management, wherever it's coming from, right? And there's usually a delta. But if you already have this baseline, then you can also bring them into that job of, okay, let's brainstorm how are we going to meet the two. And then together you can also then rise up and say, okay, these are the top 3 absolute things we've got to bring across the line, right? Combined with wherever you are in your pipeline, what can cross over, all this kind of stuff. I think the more that you're bringing your people into that journey, provided that they understand, again, what's the vision, what's the go-to-market, you know, what are our primary use cases, provided they've got all that baseline, then already you're having a different type of conversation with them. And by the time you're doing that gap analysis and brainstorming, they've already got some, I mean, of course, they're going to be, you know, shock and awe at whatever the bigger number is, but they have some elements of belief already because they already see how the year is likely to be charted in base terms, right?
Yeah.
Which then kind of folds into to what your kind of, you know, cadence is throughout the year, right? Now, one thing I am not is what I call a kind of Salesforce jockey administrating as a leader. Because I just look at people like that and I think you're just looking at retrospective numbers, right? And I've seen people who do their kind of weekly meetings, which are supposed to be tactical, right? But they're just looking in terms of what's on the pipeline, what are you committing to drop this month or this quarter, whatever it might be, with no real sensibility of how do we advance that quicker? What are the challenges? What else is coming, right? And then quite often those types of leaders don't then have a more strategic monthly or quarterly where they're looking back and looking forward and perhaps asking the group, you know, what did we do well? What did we do badly? You know, what can we do differently?
Yeah.
Right. I think already if you're having those types of dialogues with people, not only will people feel included and part of a mission, but again, their creative juices should be sparked, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you have people, as I say, in service of metrics, which probably are not giving you results. So I think it's a large part of that, and then of course, you know, I would never. I'm a great believer again in executive presence within big deals, right?
Yeah.
Because again, why do people buy from you, right? It's because they think you understand their challenges and problems better than anyone else.
Yeah.
They see someone that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis that they trust, and then they're seeing that that person has executive backing.
Yes.
And someone who will give that person what they need for this deal to be successful, right? And there's an escalation point and things like that. And all of that, of course, becomes much more important as you're dealing with, you know, markets in Asia Pacific, right? Because again, it's about trust. It's about conveyance that your business is super important to us, you know? So, and I think that's vitally important, whether you're talking about new business or you're landing and expanding in existing business as well. And of course, the closer you are to all of that, the better you as a leader know your markets. I just don't understand leaders who don't understand market dynamics, right? And who aren't close to them, because how can they ask for investment? How can they bring a data-driven approach to, okay, the product's here, but it needs to be here, and I need you to prioritize that if you can't bring numbers from the marketplace, right? Or equally, you can't say, let's go into Indonesia because the TTB or the total addressable market is XYZ, and I'm seeing these conversations. You can't do that if you're stuck in your office, right?
No, that's right.
And it's not. So again, you know, I think, don't get me wrong, I think everything changes when you become a sales leader, right? In the sense that you've got to attend to your executive suite relationships. But to my mind, that's about alignment.
Mm.
That's about them understanding where and how they can invest for what outcomes, right? You've got to invest time with your cross-functional colleagues. The leaders of other functions like operations, support, have to understand what your priorities are and what you're gunning for. And equally, you need to understand theirs and meld the
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
so that you're a combined force. And you have to be on the ground or with your team
Mm.
if you're going to do this. And you know, again, if you hear a sales leader saying there's no go-to-market plan, I'm sorry, that's your responsibility, you know?
Well, they often wonder. They often think, well, that's marketing's plan, or that's the chief revenue officer. That's the strategic senior executive group. They haven't given us the plan yet. Well, sometimes they don't give us the sales number until the second quarter, but that's another
Right.
conversation altogether. But we've got to take responsibility because as you
Yeah.
were talking there, I'm thinking to myself the importance of having a what I call a flat hierarchy, and that is
Mm,
attitude of servitude, where senior executives come in and they're not there to puff their chest out and say, "Hey, I'm just going to be the white knight and I'll get the deal done, guys. Let me
mm,
out." It's a case of coming in, and this is the mark of a great sales culture. The
mm.
senior executive comes in and says to the salesperson or says to the sales leader, "What do you need me to do? What is the role you want me to play? Lead me,"
Yeah.
right? Be humble and saying, "Hey,
Yeah.
I might carry this title, but right now this title is inconsequential. How can
Yeah.
I help you and therefore the business get this deal across the line? What do you need from me?" And that's
100%.
a huge thing because then it creates an environment where people who don't necessarily see these senior executives on a regular basis all of a sudden
Mm.
start to see them more and more. They start to realize, hey, they're actually human beings, but more importantly, they're
Yeah.
asking me for help. What does that
Yeah.
create in terms of the mindset of the salespeople?
No, 100%. I think this is most obvious when you have key accounts, right?
Mm,
And again, if you do your analysis, you're probably going to find that 20% of everything is coming from a minority of customers, right? And those
yeah.
those are the guys that if you're not treating them as a sales challenge and you're not understanding, and mapping out those buying cohorts and whether you can expand to other countries or whether you can cross-sell or what have you, then you're planning to fail, right?
Mm,
And if you lose one of those already, you're putting a dent below the waterline of any financial year. But this comes to that old analogy of bow ties versus diamonds, right? To my mind, because one of and this is also blending into culture as well, I think, because if you start if you have an owner of an account and they're open-minded and trusting enough to open up relationships across the board, right? So, you have executive sponsor to executive sponsor.
mm,
If you're working in Australia, I did this with Flight Centre, for example. So obviously the management suites in Australia, but they're operating in the UK, they're operating in the US. So you marry off your executives in those countries as
yeah.
well, right?
Yeah.
And and this is not only going to help you identify other opportunities for your pipeline, right? It's going to help you convey what's the culture of your country, company to the culture of your customers' company. Because again, people like to buy from people who not only understand their problems, but are culturally aligned.
Mm,
So if you've got similar values, you should be talking about them, you know,
totally.
because you're combining your missions and you're winning together.
Yeah.
And you can't do that if you've got this bow tie approach of a gatekeeper on both sides, and you'll lose so much opportunity that's on the table,
Yeah.
Um, and it's the only way you can really defend and dominate any account like that. So I 100% agree with you. But that question that you pose there of a leader who's vulnerable enough and supportive enough to ask the question, what do you need? What role do you want me to play? That's not always there, right? But
No, it's
the
not.
best leaders will have that in their locker.
Yeah, and the reason I mention that, Richard, I've seen it many, many times. So I worked for big companies, and Telstra was one of the bigger ones that I worked for in Australia here.
Mm,
So
Yeah.
I saw a lot of leaders in senior positions that, let's just say, got a little bit overinflated in terms of their own self-importance based on the role they thought they had and the position they had, and
Mm,
therefore they were driven more by ego. And so they
right.
almost had to maintain this sort of gravitas around ego and act in a certain way, versus other leaders who perhaps had a background in putting culture at the forefront of what they were doing, had an attitude of gratitude, an attitude of servitude, and all that sort of stuff,
Mm,
and didn't get caught up in their title. They were there to help. They were genuinely there to help.
mm,
That created a completely different dynamic in terms of the cultural elements of the team. And what
yes.
was really fascinating is, if I looked at some of those bigger deals, the ones that really had sustainability and the ones that really got really well done in terms of profitability were the
Yes.
ones where we had the senior leaders who were more than happy to roll their sleeves up and be told what to do, right?
Mm,
Not
yeah.
coming in and saying, well, I am the senior XYZ bloody insert title here. I know how
Yes.
to run this. Let me come
Yes.
in. Because sometimes they would come in and they wouldn't be briefed enough, and they'd end up completely destroying the whole opportunity because they thought they knew better and they didn't want to listen because they didn't
Yeah.
ask. They didn't
Yeah.
ask those questions. How do you need me to be? Right?
Yeah.
Versus,
Yeah.
I know what to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Completely different.
Yeah. It's an incredible point. You know, one of the best leaders I ever worked for, brought his executive coach to an executive leadership offsite where we were talking about a complete, we had a very aggressive plan for the next year, but we were trying to align how we could better work together. So there were cultural elements to this as well, but you basically had every function, including legal, including HR, everybody, to basically weld a unit at a leadership level to go forward. And he's got his executive coach there who's effectively observing him and how he interacts with his people,
Yeah.
which is incredibly vulnerable. But it's actually something that when you reflect on, you're like, wow, okay, this person, to all intents and purposes, is the most experienced, knowledgeable person that I've worked with, but still they feel they're not quite there, or still they feel there's something to be learned,
Yeah.
and there's feedback to be gained. And I think that is an incredibly powerful thing. But again, it tends to come from those environments where those leaders are already on those journeys or open to those journeys, right? Again, company culture can drive the types of behaviors in the other direction, the not so positive direction, as you kind of mentioned there as well. And I think ultimately the danger of that is that you don't win deals. I'll give you an example. Three times in my career, I've built customer bases from nothing, right? And one was in a payments company that pivoted from payments to electronic invoicing, both inbound and outbound.
Yeah.
The first deal we won was DHL Express in Europe, which is huge. And we beat IBM, we beat CMG Logica, we beat e-invoicing giants. And we didn't even have a demo. We didn't even have a product, I'll be honest with you.
Yeah.
And I remember the customer got some feedback from IBM. Basically, they came in and said, you bought a Ferrari for the glove box, right? Now, this project was so successful, it got rolled out all the way through Europe. We white labeled it. I was reselling it for another part of DHL. We did deals with companies like Bayer and Hilti. So, this became a full-on solution.
Yeah.
Um, you can't do that if you've got arrogant leadership, because part and parcel of this, I mean, how did we win that? I mean, we did a better job of understanding what the problems were. We weren't PowerPoint led. We were having conversations. We brought our executive in. But if you brought someone arrogant into that, which I don't want to say it, but I am going to say it, like an IBM type of approach, like why would you go with anyone else? We're IBM, right? Well,
Well,
what
nobody's
happened?
been
They
sacked.
didn't win it.
Yeah. Nobody's been sacked for buying IBM, have they?
No, that's so true. I have had the opposite experience, by the way. You're too risky to go with. You're a startup. You already have big customers. I'm going to go with IBM. Okay, I've seen both, but I think the point is, if you're so single-minded in your approach towards your business, your teams, your customers, you're probably going to lose a lot of
Mm.
good business on the way, I would suggest.
Yeah, absolutely. Which kind of as we sort of bring this to a close, I want to ask you some questions just on what leaders can think about that are sitting there right now contemplating. But as you're talking about there, I'm thinking about the importance of, and this is a cultural thing, being really conscious of how you bring people in and who you bring, and being really
Mm.
selective and knowledgeable, because it means you need to know what your strengths are, and you need to know
Mm.
perhaps where your blind spots are, so we can build a
Yeah,
diverse, I guess, team, or a diverse leadership team that brings
yeah,
different flavors, which adds to the culture.
yeah.
How important, based on your experience and all the things you've seen, is leaders that have this capacity to actively seek out people who are different to them, that they know may add obviously diversity, but that with that might bring challenge.
I I have a story about that actually. um, um, but let me just touch on something else you said. You know, not being the finished article. I think you were talking about as well, right? I think if as a leader you're not listening to yourself and analyzing yourself as one of the data inputs to your business and how you
Mm.
show up as a leader, again, you're minimizing your leadership journey.
Mm.
And again, I just think back to two scenarios. One when I was first promoted, and one when I was first asked to go in and turn around an environment. It's so easy just to get busy being busy,
Yeah.
right? But internally, you may have a maelstrom of different emotions, and a lot of those will be negative, and they could be imposter syndrome, they could be fear of conflict, they could be
Mm.
all kinds of things. But if you're not unpacking those or acknowledging them, unpacking them, preparing yourself for when they come, understanding why they come, you're just going to show up as someone different
Yeah.
or less evolved as you could be. So I think that's an important point. Um, yeah, diversity I think is incredibly important. I remember I was hiring for, so again, this was the turnaround situation that I was headhunted into 6 years ago here in Singapore. And the team, it was an American company, but the team here in Asia Pacific was incredibly isolated, wasn't functioning. We had some sort of weaponized information going on as well, things like that. Um, and this was a billion dollar, company, the one that we ultimately doubled within under 2 years. But there was a point where there was literally two of us left in the business. And the most experienced, I had to let go the most experienced, knowledgeable person,
Right.
which
Yep.
is a kind of frightening concept. And I was also new to this industry, right? So, there's a lot of issues there. Um, so I'm now looking to hire people, and I need to hire someone who was going to be part of our implementation and support team, who would have the qualities to be able to go and find their own solutions, because there was no way I could teach their role to them. There was no way, there was no information anywhere, basically. I could call on support from overseas, but you're in a different time zone, et cetera, et cetera. So I needed someone who understood the environment they were coming into and would have, the self-propulsion to be able to go and build their job essentially.
Yeah.
And I remember I had a candidate and I liked her, but I couldn't understand a word. I couldn't understand her, right? And this is another type of cultural thing, of course. Um, but what I had started doing was involving whoever was left, so there's just me and one other person in those interview processes, because really the truth of the matter was this person will be working with that team, right? More than they would be with me.
Yeah.
And I also phoned up her ex-boss and I said, listen, I think I might be making a bad decision here based upon myself and not based upon, where I think this person has skills. And he laid my mind to rest. He said he totally understood what was going on. My team also laid my mind to rest. And I hired that person anyway, even though I knew I had some difficulties, right?
Yeah.
And it turned out to be the best, actually one of the best hires I've ever made
Brilliant.
in my entire career. So I think, and again, anecdotally, I've heard things like there was a time at Google when they were template hiring, right? And then they suddenly found that they weren't creating, new solutions, or that they were basically acting like a template organization suddenly. So I think diversity is incredibly important because, you know, let's forget the market that we're in, right? Which is probably the most diverse from a cultural and a business point of view on the planet. Forget that. Just from a team perspective, how else can you introduce other ideas, other experiences, other voices to a group, unless you are hiring, from different backgrounds, from different experiences, maybe even from different industries.
Totally. Totally.
But again, you've got to have that mindset to be able to create the environment where that works, support people as they're either transitioning into new industries or roles or whatever it might be, and having that idea that good ideas can come from anywhere.
That's it.
And supporting that, right?
Absolutely.
So again, I think that's part of cultural leadership, 100%. But
Yeah.
those companies that do embrace diversity, I think, are more successful, generally speaking, than those who don't.
Yeah, love it, mate. What a great way to finish. I'm not gonna ask you a question about because I want to get people to get your book. So I've got
Oh,
another call to be on in 2 minutes. So I'm not so conscious of time.
yeah.
So Richard, this has been a phenomenal conversation. You've shared so much gold and so much wisdom, and I think we're on the same page. So I'm glad that we've connected. I really enjoyed this conversation. For people that want to know more about you and to connect with you, but more importantly, get hold of your book, The Cultural
Yeah.
Sales Leader Sustaining People, Attaining Results, where's the best place for them to do that?
Well, thank you so much for that, and I really enjoyed this conversation, Darren. It's exceptional meeting you, and I love your podcast and the voices that you bring onto it. Yeah, so the book is available everywhere you can get books. It's up on Amazon in most countries. It's on Apple Books. It's on Google Books, Barnes and Noble, and other places. It's electronic form and paperback, of course. Where can you find me? richardcogswell.com or LinkedIn. I can share my LinkedIn profile, and I'm sharing a lot of this type of content, and sort of prelims to next books as well. But yeah, if you
Brilliant.
do find my book, I thank you for that, and please do let me know what you think of it.
Excellent. Mate, it's been an absolute pleasure. Enjoy the nice, beautifully warm weather in
I
Singapore.
will.
And
Thank
thank you
you.
once again for being on the podcast, mate. Greatly appreciated.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Darren.
Thank you for listening to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast. I trust the information in this episode has been helpful in your journey towards becoming exceptional. And remember, please take the time to rate the show, subscribe to the show so other people can find it. But also, if I can help you, jump on my calendar, go to leadwithdarren.com, and let's have a conversation about how I can help you along your journey to being exceptional.